Alright, so I'm bringing a book review today on Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. So just a little background on her. She was born on December 16th, 1775, and specifically born in England, Somerton, whatnot. And ever since she was a little girl, she was actually obsessed and crazy about writing, and as a 12-year-old, she actually took it pretty serious. She was mainly lonely, and she was very depressed at some points, but she had a loving family that made her happy. One day, she died on, 1817 in July. But before she died, there was this one night on December 2nd, 1802. She was proposed to by a very wealthy man, and she said yes just to get financial help. And but then the next morning she woke up after thinking about it and backed out right away. So this poor wealthy man, even though he had money, he was pretty heartbroken. Alright, now on to main characters, and the first people I'll be starting with is the Bennet family. So here's Mr. Bennet, and he's pretty casual within the novel, but he eventually dies. And then we have Mrs. Bennet, who's obsessed with marrying off her daughters to wealthy men, and they have a daughter, also a main character in the novel, named Elizabeth. Elizabeth has 4 sisters. The first one I'm drawing here is Mary, and she's quite nerdy and quiet. Then we have Lydia, and we also have Kitty. Kitty is basically Lydia's mini-me because they are both obsessed with rich men, falling in love, and yeah. Then we also have Jane, and Jane, I guess you could say, is Queen Bee of the sisters, or the perfect daughter, and everybody loves Jane. And she eventually marries Bingley. Elizabeth's sassy, Mary loves reading and music. Now moving on to the next character is Mr. Bingley, and Mr. Bingley is a wealthy man that eventually falls in love with Jane. Mrs. Bennet was actually rooting for Bingley and Jane to get married because money! Again, wealthy men, just, perfect for Miss Bennet. Then Bingley has a friend, or best friend, who is also rich, named Mr. Darcy. He eventually falls in love with Elizabeth. Alright, next character we have is Mr. Collins. Really rich guy, which isn't a shock, there's a lot of rich men in here. And yeah, so fun fact about him, a big part that played in the novel was him proposing to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth was obviously like, no, he's not the best. But then we had Mrs. Bennet, who was in the background cheering her on, and the thought of that basically made Elizabeth want to vomit. So after being rejected by Elizabeth, obviously Mr. Collins was heartbroken, but then Charlotte, another character in the novel, came in, and she is actually BFFs, or best friends, with Elizabeth. And so Elizabeth was fine until she found out that Mr. Collins had a thing for Charlotte, and he actually proposed to her, and Charlotte said yes, and they were in love, but she was mainly in love with his money. So to start off the novel, there's a conversation between Mrs. Bennet and Mr. Bennet, and basically Mrs. Bennet hears that a rich man named Mr. Bingley is coming to town, and as we all know, she's the character that is obsessed with marrying her daughters off. So she tells Mr. Bennet that you need to meet him. We need to go see him. The girls need to meet him. Jane getting married with Bingley means that she'll have money, lots of money, since he's very wealthy. And so obviously she's in love with the fact that her daughter will be financially stable. So basically what happens now is that Jane goes to this ball, meets Bingley, and Bingley and her are dancing, and they basically hit it off pretty well. But then Jane got very, very, very sick, and she stayed with Bingley's family, and Bingley basically took care of her until she got better. a little while after Mr. Bennet dies, and the Bennet family is hit pretty hard, especially financially, since now they don't have anyone to make money for them, and so they're sad. Their bank account is low. But Mr. Bingley thinks, oh, Jane's family is in trouble, so a good relative of Mr. Bingley's, Mr. Collins, decides to give the Bennet family money, which obviously makes them happy, makes the amount happy, makes the family happy. They're not struggling anymore. But while he was doing that, he had his eyes on Elizabeth. Elizabeth was his crush, I guess you could say. So then, a little while after, the militia came into town, and there's this man named Mr. Wickman, and he is talking to Elizabeth in this scene, and all the sisters are there because they're wanting to meet all the militiamen, but he tells Elizabeth that Darcy practically ruined his life, and later on we find out that this is a lie. So Elizabeth right now is kind of unsure and shocked that Mr. Darcy would ever do that. So then, here we are at this ball, another ball, and shockingly, Mr. Darcy, who's usually very grumpy and very mellow and sarcastic, decides to ask Elizabeth, who is also sarcastic, what a coincidence, to dance. As they're dancing, Darcy is starting to have more feelings for her, and she's unsure about him. The next day, right after the ball, Mr. Collins got down on one knee and proposed to Elizabeth, as I've mentioned before. He obviously gets rejected because Elizabeth has no interest in him. So then Mr. Collins gets sad and butthurt, and eventually here comes Charlotte, and he gets engaged to her, proposes to her, and they get married, and he actually uses his relationship with Charlotte to make Elizabeth jealous throughout the novel, which was quite childish. Once again, Charlotte is only in love with his money, though. So one day, Jane happens to get a letter from Mr. Bingley. She's obviously very excited about it because she hasn't heard from him in a while, and they're together, they have this fling going on, but then she gets hit with, "I'm breaking up with you," basically a breakup letter. And she's sad, she's crying, so she goes to London with her aunt and uncle, but dealing with her heartbreak. Little did she know that Bingley sister was behind it all. The shocking thing, though, is that the reason that that Bingley's sister decided to write this letter and do this was because Darcy convinced Mr. Bingley that Jane was a gold digger and that she was only in love with him for his money because of how Mrs. Bennet was about being financial and everything. And so Bingley was like, yeah, it's best for me, you're right. So then this takes us to the scene where Elizabeth is talking to Darcy about what happened between Jane and Bingley, and Darcy tells her, yo, I convinced him that Jane was a gold digger. But then right after he proposes to her, and obviously Elizabeth's gonna say no. But then Elizabeth gets shocking news that Mr. Wickman, who is a liar, and her sister Lydia, who's crazy about boys and, militiamen and money, ran away without telling anyone, and they decided to get married. So after Bingley and Jane cleared things up, they got engaged, and obviously that led up to them getting married as well. But then Darcy and Elizabeth agree to fix things, clear things up, get along, and they get married as well. And that is the end of the novel. So, some themes that I pointed out while I was reading this novel were the themes of marriage and love, and a really big one, sexism. And this theme of sexism actually shows the time that the novel was written in, which was 1797. And back in this time, there were basically teenage girls, about 13 to 14, who were marrying old or older wealthy men. The style that the author had, Jane Austen, the thing I liked about it was that through her use of dialogue and how she would put an emphasis on some words actually showed the attitudes of some of the characters. It showed Elizabeth's sarcasm, Mr. Darcy's sarcasm. It showed how frustrated Mrs. Bennet would get whenever the girls or Mr. Bennet were on her nerves. She actually made it feel like you were actually in the situation. Some symbols that I noticed were mainly Darcy's home, whenever Elizabeth and them go to Darcy's home. In a way, to me, it shows that that is where his true character is, and how nice his home was shows how nice of a person he was, mainly as a character. Important quotes. There's only one that really stood out to me, and I had to put a bookmark in my book right whenever I saw it. And it's Mr. Darcy saying it, and it actually shows his sarcasm and moody side, I guess you could say. So it is, a lady's imagination is very rapid. It jumps from admiration to love, from love to matrimony in a moment. And I found that kind of funny because how, I don't want to say dumb, but basically how dumb these girls were, thinking, oh, I meet a guy one night, oh my gosh, he proposes me the next day, and oh my gosh, it's true love. So yeah, Darcy was probably one of my favorite characters as well because of how sarcastic he was, and I can probably relate on a personal level with that. And yeah, some prompts or advice that I'd give to the AP reader, whoever reads this book, is you could use this book for any prompt that asks for what is your class in society, like whatever class you're in your society. How does that affect you, the way you act? How does that affect your situation? Also, people who are forced into situations that they don't have control over. For example, the teenage girls who are forced to marry the older men. You could use Lydia, you could use Jane, you could use Elizabeth even, because she did marry an older man, but I mean, she didn't really have anything against it. Also Charlotte married Mr. Collins, so he was very old actually, so yeah. That's basically all the advice I have. I hope you enjoyed my book review. Definitely didn't procrastinate at all.